there in fact such thing as a reliable BMW SUV? Well, guess what? I'm going to walk down through all the different models, some of the critical quirks as well as reliability concerns, and share with you the most reliable SUV in the BMW lineup today. Let's get into it now. Whether we're talking about the BMW X1 or the BMW X3, or the BMW X4, or the X7, or the illustrious BMW X2. There's literally a BMW for virtually every market. So depending if you want a crossover SUV, full size, smaller, more compact, there's lots of choices and it makes it very difficult, but no two BMW SUVs are the same. The bottom of the barrel entry-level SUV in the BMW lineup, what we're talking about is the BMW X1. You can get a drivetrain currently in 2023, has a turbo 4-cylinder engine, 2-liter displacement, makes about 240 horsepower. And now, for about 40 grand, you get a standard all-wheel drive system, 7-speed auto. It's a little sweetheart. It's a conventional SUV, sits fairly upright. And if I could make the suggestions, the most reliable versions of the X1s would typically start around 2017. If you go older X1s, you're going to have other issues. For example, you have oil leaks coming out of the oil filter housing. You can have coolant leaks. Lots of those are typically an issue. You can have foggy headlights. You can also get foggy windscreens and squeaky seats, if you can believe it. Now, there were a few other problems in terms of quality control. Overall, they're not the worst vehicle for reliability in the BMW lineup. Because they're so bare bones, there are just less things to go wrong. So the BMW X1 is typically a fairly reliable, fairly durable workhorse. Great, fun to drive, and relatively affordable. Then you move up into the X2, which is essentially a shrunken version of the X1. What it is basically a sport AV or sport activity vehicle. It's shrunken from the roof down, but the length and the overall drivetrain, engine, transmission are all the same as the X1. It's basically built on the same chassis. The difference is, of course, that the bodywork is slightly revised. You have a sportier looking vehicle that's more sport tuned to drive, and it's actually a very, very quick shifting transmission coupled up to these. The X2s are relatively durable too, and of course with the latest version of the B48 engine, you're going to anticipate relatively reliable engines and drivetrains. Now, there were issues with fuel rails, there were some issues, of course, with other recalls related to backup cameras and so on, but overall, that vehicle is quite reliable. It's more bare bones, there's far less features, less to go wrong, and that's the key with a lot of BMWs. The less complexity means the more reliable. So after the X1 and 2, of course, naturally comes the X3, and you'll start to see the trend there. The X3, again, is what I'd like to call the sweet spot. It's the sweetheart vehicle in the BMW SUV lineup, simply because it has a couple of great different engines. Of course, the latest and greatest features a base engine of a 2-liter turbo 4, which actually is called the B48, which is known in BMW world as one of the most dependable engines in modern history. Of course, makes just over 240 horsepower. Even better is the B58 engine, which you can find in the X3 40M. And of course, there's yet one even better, which is the X3M. What we're dealing with there is an S63. They are hot engines and probably some of the most reliable engines in the lineup. So the latest variations of the X3 are clearly the most dependable, and stick with a 2017 and newer, and you should be good for numbers of years. However, if you get stuck buying an older generation X3, you could find yourself with a world of hurt. Things like valve cover gaskets, you can find coolant leaks, and of course those infamous hoses, those rad hoses with the keyed fittings, plastic ends, they tend to split and crack with multiple heat cycles. Also oil filter housing gasket leaks and naturally pan gasket valve cover leaks. Oil coolant leaks are the name of the game with some of the older drivetrains. Think about the old N20, that's the older 2-liter turbo 4. Timing chain failures galore. That is a big issue with some of the earlier, older variations of that X3s. That's the G01, and you can find yourself with a very reliable vehicle, regardless of which engine configuration, because that 4-cylinder, the base turbo 6, and the upgraded turbo 6s are all very hot engines, quite reliable, and so far showing much more promise than some of the outgoing engines. Of course, you can expect some of the other typical issues, windshield issues. Of course, you can get rattles and creaks from the sunroof and potential leaks. That's a common issue. As well, we talk about condensation, humidity in the headlights is a common issue that a lot of people complain about. You can also get some overheating, particularly if you have a bad thermostat or you're leaking coolant, you don't take care of the levels. Because it tends to leak, you might see problems like that. But again, as I say, stick with the newer engines and you'll typically be quite safe to go. The X3 is the sweetheart, and that is likely going to be one of their most reliable vehicles, simply because it doesn't quite hit the mark with other more complex technologies, which we'll get into shortly after the X4. Then we move into the X4, which naturally, if you can start to predict the way BMW designs their vehicles and the nomenclature, the X4 is again, like the X2 was to the One, a shrunken SAV version of the X3. Pretty much the same engines, transmissions, the M versions, the Hot 6s and the Hot 4s, so the B48, the B58s. You can find some of the same quality control issues, seat belts, backup cameras, foggy headlights, some of the quality controls with some of the plastics that tend to come apart, especially on the back of the seat rails. They tend to break off or fall apart and you'll get squeaky seats. But for the most part, these vehicles are showing far more promise than the outgoing older generation of the X3s and X4s. Then of course next in line is the glorious X5, which is clearly one of BMW's top selling SUVs, primarily because its functionality. It's a good mid-size SUV. You can tow weight with it. It has lots of room, lots of capacity, and some great engine choices. Of course, with the X5, now we introduce another new drivetrain. Of course, you can also get the 3-liter turbo 6-cylinder engine called the B58, which is their hot engine, and that's the sweet spot even with the modern-day X5. Remember, that new B58 has been much improved. BMW realized they had some problems with the outgoing N55 engine that you would find in the X5, and water pumps are a plastic problem. Now in the new B58, they shed the electric water pump, which was prone to failure because of the excess heat. It tend to crack and split and wear out after about 50, 60, 70,000 miles. You'd be doing a water pump, and a water pump thermostat combo would cost you anywhere from $2,000 to $3,000 to do at the shop. So clearly customers were getting tired of that. So in the new B58 engine with the Turbo 6 in the latest and greatest X5, it no longer has an electric water pump. It's now back to a mechanical water pump. They are no longer gluttons for punishment. But also in the X5, you also introduce the N63, which is a twin turbo V8 called the Hot V. Puts 2 turbos within the V of the engine. Unfortunately, it creates a lot of heat in that space. Historically, with the older generations of the N63, you had a lot of problems with premature oil consumption, excessive oil consumption because of valve guides melting down. You have plastics deteriorating. You had excessive battery draw. There was a lot of issues with the early generation of the N63, but they've created a couple generations later. They've beefed up cooling, they've beefed up some of the shielding, they've beefed up some of the internals, and the latest generation of the X5 has been improved marginally. With that said, the sweet spot again with the X5 has to go to the beautiful B58 engine with the 40 series designation. That's the engine you want to go with most of these modern day BMWs. Now, unfortunately, the X5, if you go back older generations, you had N55s and you had some of the older engines that were more problematic. With that, you can expect a whole plethora of issues in the X5. Coolant leaks, oil leaks from the valve cover gasket and pan gaskets, the oil filter housing and gaskets, water ingress in the headlights, but even more importantly, CV boots breaking. You had front engine suspension issues. You could get the self-leveling air ride suspension on a lot of X5s, and that was a massive issue for a lot of those vehicles. Of course, you'd come out and you find the rear end sitting on the ground, and that was usually an indication that an airbag was gone, it was leaking, or your air compressor failed to pump those airbags back up. A set of airbags typically could cost you a couple grand at the dealer. If you had an air compressor, expect another $1,000. If you had a serious problem in that system, you could expect to spend a few $1,000 just to keep that self-leveling suspension working. So if I could suggest, if you need to have the X5, go with that turbo B58 engine, 6 cylinders, and you should be good to go. As you move into the X6, you have a very similar situation again as you had the others, where the X6 is the flattened, shrunken down version of the X5, which of course is more of a sport activity vehicle. It looks more like an egg shape, but again, you're going to see similar drivetrains, Turbo 6, the Turbo V8, and of course you're going to have the 8-speed ZF automatic transmission, which is bulletproof. So the transmissions are rarely the issue with a lot of these BMWs. It's often related more to the cooling system leaks, overheating, and some of the other problems around the engine. Remember, if you go diesel, the older diesels can be very reliable, but the problem is more related to the emission systems, EGR systems. Of course, a lot of people end up doing deletes on the EGR and the DPF and the DEF heaters. Lots of issues in the emission systems. If you have a Euro version or a deleted car, you can have an engine that typically lasts a long time, but a fuel injector might cost you $2,000 to do. Times that by 6, it can get very, very costly vehicle to run, although they are quite bulletproof. The X5, the X6 typically ramp up the complexity scale, and as a result, you would typically expect more failures, more expensive repairs, more intensive maintenance, and it's probably not your sweet spot in terms of reliability, although it's your best sweet spot for overall driving enjoyment. Then, of course, there would be an X7, go figure, and BMW has created that next level, next scale SUV that is larger and in charge. They're trying to compete with vehicles in the Infiniti world, in the Cadillac Escalade world. They want to provide a vehicle that's full scale, full size, large and in charge, and they give you that with the X7, and the X7 does come with a plethora of new technology above and beyond what you'll find even in the X5 and X6, and of course there's more tech. You're going to anticipate potentially more failures. There's also some new designs, which does create extra complexity. Now, the X7 will be the least reliable of the brand, and a lot of that just comes down to specific issues. For example, headlight wiring is known to come loose or melt, and of course your headlights either stay burnt on or stay off, and you have troubles there. And of course you can expect the same engines and transmissions as you would with the X5 and 6, and so you would anticipate either the B58, which is quite reliable, or the N63, which is also quite stout these days in the latest generations. But again, you have the latest and greatest 8-speed automatic by ZF, which is also quite bulletproof. Unfortunately, you may anticipate leaks later on in life, coolant, oil leaks. That seems to be the way of life for a lot of BMWs. Other issues you might find with modern day X7s could be the infamous high pressure fuel pump, but most BMWs can suffer from that nowadays, unfortunately, because it injects at a high pressure. So you have bad fuel contamination, or just the duty cycle of these injection systems might mean that you may have to change high pressure fuel injectors prematurely, and certainly the HFPF system might go altogether, and that's a very expensive proposition. And with that high pressure fuel pump failing, you might notice stuttering of the engine, hesitation, or even a hard cranking, but it just won't start. Could be any host of issues that cause poor running, of course, may actually come and stem from the fuel system. Naturally, as I said before, the leaking oil filter housing gasket could be an issue. It seems to be a BMW issue, and just the way they inherently design their oil filter system naturally creates these potentials for leaks. There's naturally two different rubberized type gaskets that you'll find. One that mates up the oil filter housing to the engine, and another one that mates up the cooler to the oil filter housing. And between those two, there are this rubberized, odd-shaped type of oil gasket. Eventually, they get compressed and they start to leak. Unfortunately, cooling and heating systems and HVAC systems are known as well in the X7s, and heater cores are not exempt, and sadly that can be a very expensive proposition, especially from a labor perspective if you have to start tearing the vehicle half apart to get access to it. Power windows also known to be an issue where they may not work altogether, or the infamous window regulator goes bad on a lot of these BMWs. This one is no different. As well, you can expect excessive corrosion on the wheels for some reason. Can't forget the infamous Vanos rattle, and sadly that is something that does potentially afflict many BMWs. And the Vanos is a variable valve timing system, and a lot of times the solenoids fail, or sometimes you just get that infamous rattling noise you'll hear under the hood. That's often your Vanos system starting to flake out on you, and that could mean expensive servicing. Of course, there's hydraulic systems related to the brakes that could let you down, as well as suspension problems galore, where it starts clunking and banging and make premature noises. And a lot of that, of course, is chalked up to the fact that the X7 is historically a larger than in charge type vehicle, and as a result, all that extra weight and burden on the chassis means there's more stress and strain on a lot of the suspension and steering parts, creating premature failure in those areas. That is going to be an expensive proposition. So the bottom line is, as you move up the range in the BMW SUV lineup, you're going to get more technology, better driving experiences, much more cushy rides, and more luxury. The downside is it usually comes with some extra cost, maintenance, services, and repairs. Think about after 5 years and the warranty's gone. That's when things start to really hurt. So none of this really matters if you plan to only keep the vehicle for 3 years and you have the vehicle under the warranty period. That's fine if you plan to pitch it before that time is up. However, if you're one of those people that like to keep your vehicle for 5, 7, maybe 10 years, typically stick with the vehicles that are equipped with the B58. That's the turbo 6-cylinder engine. And the later generations, 2017 or 18 and newer, are going to get you some of those drivetrains, as well as staying away from anything higher than an X5, because now you're introducing extra tech. You've got the air ride suspension systems, and you're going to have expensive maintenance and repairs there. What is the most reliable modern day BMW SUV? That has to go to the modern G01 BMW X3 M40i series. That has the sweet spot, the best engine, the best gearbox combination, the most fun to drive, well leveled out in terms of versatility and space, and that's clearly the vehicle that you want to drive if reliability is your key objective and you want to incorporate a little fun in that. And with all of that said, right there, you're going to want to check that video out, because it's all about how did BMW finally become more reliable than modern day Hondas. Hope to see each and every one of you on the next one. We'll see you real soon. Bye-bye. In terms of the turbo 6-cylinder engine, but however, the new B50